Hello and welcome to the Gravel Road, my channel all about cycling. Cycling on the road, cycling on the gravel, during the day, during the night. I'll be getting into subjects like tech, nutrition, training and all the other stuff that us cyclists like to bore our friends and family with on a daily basis. So let's get into this one, which is actually part of a series of videos on an event I took part in recently called Red Bull Time Lapse. If you want to check out the other videos in this series, look for the playlist called Red Bull Time Lapse 2021. In there you'll find 4 videos of training rides, and within those videos I cover subjects such as riding at night and gravel riding and what the pros and cons are. So if those are subjects that are interesting to you, within those videos you can find information about them. Then there are a few videos labelled part 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And part 3 is the previous video to this one, and that's actually event day. So that's me just trying to capture as much as I could about the event and before I set off, during and right after the event. This video is part 4. It's going to be just a bit of a look back and an overview, checking out some of the Strava data and just sort of putting in some comments about how I felt it went and how I felt my planning went, looking back on the event now. But going forward, I'll be doing a bunch of more specific videos on the tips and tricks and some of the tools I use during an event like this, but also how I've used them since I started really getting back into cycling about 18 months ago. And if you're looking to push your cycling forward or maybe take part in an event, then some of those videos should be very useful to you. If there's anything specific you want to know about though, or I don't cover in these videos, definitely put questions and comments down below and I'll do my best to look at them and answer them. And if there's enough demand for a particular subject, then I'll cover that in a future video for sure. Right, so let's get into looking at this data and seeing how it all went and see what the result was. So as a very quick recap, just in case you haven't seen some of the other videos, Red Bull Time Lapse is a cycling event which happens over a 25-hour period, and it happens over the weekend. The clocks go back. So this year it was on Saturday the 30th from 1 p.m. to Sunday the 31st at 1 p.m. And that's October, because in the UK that's the month the clocks always go back. So that's how it's 25 hours, because during that 24-hour period the clocks go back 1 hour, so it actually is 25 hours of riding time. Additionally, when the clocks go back, there's this thing called a power hour, and during that hour, any miles you do are doubled. So your total mileage for the event really is like a 26-hour bike ride, but you're only really having to ride the 25 hours of that 26. So on the screen here, you can see my Strava feed for this time. So this is Red Bull Time Lapse 2021, part 1. So it's split up into 3 parts. So there's part 1, part 2 and part 3. And the reason for that is because during the power hour, you have to do a specific ride for that hour so that they can double the miles. So what I would have liked to have done and what a lot of people wanted to do was just do one continuous ride effectively on Strava or on your Garmin head unit throughout the whole thing. But I basically had to cycle up to just before 2 a.m. in the morning. At that point, I stopped my Garmin, uploaded my ride, and then started a new ride in that hour. So we're now at 1 o'clock again because the clocks have went back. And then at the end of that hour, I've stopped my Garmin again so that I can post that specific ride and get double the miles. And then after that, I've then started my Garmin again and just carried that on right through to the end. So let's scroll back to part 1 because that's where it all began. And we'll go in and have a bit of a closer look at some of the data. I did this event in 2020, and at that time I rode 293 miles and got a total Red Bull figure of 310 miles, and that was including the power hour. In 2020 it had only just gone virtual, so they didn't have as many categories and things, and they were just kind of finding their feet. So at that time, I actually rode as part of a team, but I went for a prize called the MVP, which is the most valuable player. So it was effectively a solo category, but they hadn't split it between indoors and outdoors, so people were doing it on trainers and doing it outdoors and a mixture of both. I had intended to do the whole thing outside, but the weather played its part and I ended up going on the turbo for a few hours. I came fourth last year out of everyone, and the top 3 above me had done everything completely on turbo trainers. So last year, effectively, I did the most amount of miles outside as part of Red Bull time-lapse. This year, however, in 2021, they had split up the categories a lot more, male, female, over 25s, team, solo, and then all those were split between indoor and outdoor. So I was targeting the solo outdoor category because I really couldn't face spending 25 hours on a turbo trainer. I also felt like that was a category that I had a good chance of winning, because the guys who are doing the time on the turbo trainers, they spend a lot of time doing that throughout the year, so they're very much focused on that. And the amount of mileages they spit out is crazy. So this year, my target was to hit 350 miles ridden, and then whatever that was on top of that for the power hour, but I figured it would be about 16, 17 miles on top of that. But I had a stretch target of around 400 miles. I knew the 350 miles was achievable even if the weather wasn't so great, because last year I did the 293, and I only rode 17 hours and 15 minutes, I think, out of the 25 hours that was available. So I knew that all I had to do was really go at the same pace and maybe cycle 4 more hours than I did last year, which effectively just meant not sleeping as long. Last year I slept for around about 3 to 4 hours actually after I'd been on the turbo trainer during the power hour. Also, 1 year on from that event, I'm a much stronger rider. I've cycled further than I was back then, and I'm doing a lot more miles. I think last year I did somewhere in the region of 5,500, 6,000 miles in the calendar year, and at the point of doing this event, I'm already up at around 8,000 miles. I also have a gravel bike as well, so I had that kind of string to my bow, so I knew that if weather became a factor, I could always just switch to the gravel bike and just keep churning out miles. And although it's a little bit slower, it's only a couple of miles an hour, and I knew that that would only maybe be for a short period of time. So the key thing with these endurance-based events where you're trying to do the most amount of miles in a given time is to reduce the amount of time off the bike. It doesn't matter if you're going slow, if you're doing 10 miles an hour, as long as you're on the bike, because if you're off the bike for half an hour, that could be 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 miles lost, and it's really hard to gain that back. That's a key strategy that I've learnt and implemented it in the North Coast 500 record with Josh Quigley, and also the 7-day record with Josh Quigley. Those records are, obviously you've got to be a good rider, strong, able to keep going, but fundamentally it's about staying on the bike and keep churning out that miles, and as Josh would say, keep moving forward. So with that in mind, I had my 350 target. Let's have a look at the data from the 3 rides. So this is part 1, and you can see here that I've called it Red Bull Time Lapse 2021 Part 1, and in brackets I've put banking miles, because that really was my strategy from the get-go, was to up to the power hour, so 1, 2 in the morning, was to really put in as many miles as I possibly could, and my target for that was 200 miles. So I actually slightly exceeded my target, so I was very happy when I stopped prior to the power hour beginning. I also knew that if weather and things like that didn't become a factor, or tiredness, that I was actually on pace to do 400 miles with not ease, but definitely it was achievable. However, I knew that the weather was going to be getting a lot colder and there was going to be a lot of rain at the end, so I really was set on achieving the 350 miles, and anything above that was a bonus. So you can see here 209 miles, as I've said, and that was a moving time of 11 hours and 55 minutes. The elapsed time was 12 hours and 59 minutes. So that meant in that first 13 hours I had around about an hour off the bike. That was a little bit longer than I'd originally planned, but it was fundamentally down to having to change clothes to suit the conditions. the actual weather wasn't exactly matching up with the forecast. So for example, when I went out the first hour or so, it was meant to rain. So I was set up for rain with a rain jacket and everything, but within 30 minutes I was roasting hot and it wasn't raining. So I had to stop and take the jacket off and just reconfigure my clothes a little bit. During this period, I did have probably around about a 30-minute stop, and that was kind of planned in. It was meant to be 20 minutes, but it ended up being about 30, and that was to stop as late on into the evening as possible and get a proper meal in. And I did that around about 8 p.m, maybe 8:30 p.m, something like that. I stopped after doing around about 133 miles to get a really good feed in, a proper meal, sat down and got a really good feed in at that point. I knew that was going to be a key part of the strategy, because obviously through the night it's difficult to sit down and work and get a meal sorted out. Fortunately, my wife was all prepped, ready to go, and she literally had the food waiting for me on the table. At that time as well, I knew the weather was going to be changing. There was no wind and it was really clear night, but the temperature was dropping like a stone. So I knew around about this time, 8-9 o'clock, was when I'd probably have to think about changing my clothes, or at least getting into warmer gear for the night ahead. So that's essentially what I did. I got myself prepped for the night ahead. I'd done about a third of the event in terms of time. I had 2/3 to go, and I had the hardest part coming up, which was the night time and the extreme cold. Going back to the data though, in that 209 miles, or that first 13 hours of elapsed time, my average speed was 17.5 miles per hour, which is exactly what I was planning to hit. So I was very happy about that. And also my targeted average heart rate for these kinds of things, long rides, endurance rides, is 140 beats per minute or less. So you can see here I averaged 138 beats per minute. So I was managing my effort perfectly, and I cover that. I should mention that in my part 3 video. After about 100 miles, everything was bang on. It was actually, my speed was a bit higher at that point, but over time your speed tends to come down. So I'll typically go out and be up around 18.5, 19 miles an hour at the very beginning, and then that'll just slowly work its way back over time, which is pretty common for these sorts of events. You can see my average cadence here says 68. Now, the thing with average cadence is, particularly on longer rides as well, is obviously when you're going down a hill or you're resting, you're not pedaling. So your average cadence tends to be lower than what it actually is when you're pedaling. So 70 for average cadence is actually quite good for me. I'd be looking to be actually around about 80, 85 when I'm pedaling. So that 70, taking into account all the time I'm not pedaling, would actually translate to around about 80 to 85. I do look at my head unit for cadence from time to time, but I've got to the point now where I kind of know what my cadence is when my feet are moving, and I know if I'm pedaling too slow, and I'll click and I'll start I'll change down a gear usually and just get the feet moving, because that's really a key thing. You don't want to be churning out a really slow cadence in a hard gear. You want to keep the legs moving, but not go mad. You know, if you're climbing up a really steep hill, then yeah, cadence is high. But for these types of events, you definitely want to be in the sort of 80 to 85, maybe 90 range overall. Then finally, probably on here, you can see the temperature says 41F. I think I usually work in Celsius, but that's round about freezing. So if we click on here, you can see a bit more detail on the weather. So you can see headwinds, but this range of 4.2 to 23 miles per hour is a bit misleading, because it was really windy for the first couple of hours, but realistically there was virtually zero wind from about 2 hours in. It was very calm. It has a temperature range here of 5.5 to 9.5 degrees Celsius. Again, that's not really that accurate. When I started, the temperature was probably in the region of 10 degrees Celsius. I was cycling in a very thin base layer and just a short sleeve cycling top for the first number of hours. I then added a jacket, but I didn't have the jacket done up. I had it done up behind me, so really it was only my arms that were covered. And then as the evening progressed and the temperature started to plummet from about 8-9 degrees down to about 3 or 4 degrees in the early evening, maybe about 6 p.m, I still had my jacket open. I was still fine. And then towards the end, it was getting down towards about 0, and that's when I did my jacket up. But overall, I was perfectly dressed for the weather. My feet were starting to get a little bit cold at the end, but that's to be expected, because I was kind of went out prepped for 8-9 degrees, and when you get down to about 0 degrees, particularly when you're going at a reasonable speed, I just find my feet do tend to get cold. But I knew I was going to be stopping for this meal, and I'd be in for 15-20 minutes at least, and I knew that my feet were going to warm up, and then at that point I was going to add more layers to everywhere, my feet and everything in my hands. But overall, temperature wise and weather wise, I got it bang on. And actually up here in Aberdeenshire, where I did the event, we probably had some of the best conditions in the whole of the UK. As I touched on in some other videos, was fortunate enough to have a contact at the Met Office that we use for the challenges that we do with Josh Quigley. So she was giving me some information and telling me that there was this phenomenon called a sucker's gap, which basically meant that there was no wind in this just small pocket around where I live. But for the rest of the UK was getting pretty significant winds, and that was bringing in periodic rain as well, whereas I had completely clear skies. The only downside of that is that the temperatures drop very quickly and they stay cold. So it was around about 0 degrees for the entire night, and it didn't warm up until a good hour or so after sunset. So all in all, part 1 went brilliantly. Like, it literally couldn't have gone any better. I actually couldn't believe how well it went. I was super happy. In the run up to the power hour, I was feeling great. I wasn't tired. Legs weren't sore. I was feeling really well fueled. I just nailed it basically, and I was extremely happy at that point. Just one final thing on this is the elevation. So 4,383 feet total elevation for 209 miles. That works out at something like 200 feet per 10 miles. That's how I kind of tend to look at elevation for a bike ride. 200 feet per 10 miles around where I live is like pan flat. It's very difficult to get it any flatter than that. An average ride around here would be 400 feet per 10 miles, and that's trying to keep it flat. An average ride just going out and hitting a few hills and just having a nice bike ride would be somewhere in the region of 600 feet per 10 miles. It's very easy to get that up to 800, and if you're going to hit some hills, like specifically, easily 1,000 as well. So 200 feet per 10 miles for what I was trying to do was perfect for around here. You couldn't get it any flatter, and that's what allowed me to keep my speed up essentially, because I wasn't hitting all these hills and slowing down and stopping. It was more or less constant pedaling, with the odd little hill that allowed me to get a bit of respite and stretch the legs as I was going. And obviously that comes down to planning. It wasn't by accident. I had been out and done this route or versions of this route several times. So yeah, planning your route with something like this is so critical. If you're going to be cycling for a long period of time and you're wanting to churn out miles and keep it flat, then you really have to do some work to plan that route, particularly in somewhere like Scotland where it's very hilly. And likewise, if you're going out to do as much elevation as you can in a ride, that can be challenging too, because trying to link together hills and these kinds of things and not have too much flat. So yeah, planning, it all comes down to planning, and I'll be touching on how to use Strava and some other tools for route planning for whether it's flat, hilly, whatever you're trying to achieve. I'll touch on that in some future videos. The Power Hour really is something that's probably much more geared towards the team events where you've got 4 riders splitting the workload of the 25 hours. So in the Power Hour, you could go for it, like really go as hard as you can to double the miles as much as possible. And if you're in a team event, you could definitely do that, because you could designate one rider, maybe the fastest rider, to just hit that hour, and then someone could be cycling before or after. But when you're doing a 24, 25 hour bike ride, essentially, you're not going to absolutely burn yourself out 13 hours in. So for me, this was just about keeping going basically and putting in as many miles in the hour as I possibly could. So the Power Hour really just marked roughly the halfway point, and my mind was really more about Getting through the night, that was the key thing. Last time after the power hour, I had a long sleep because it was dark and I was tired and I was fed up with the weather. But the key thing was to do the power hour, get back on the bike as quickly as I could, and just see myself through the darkness. Because I knew that once the sun came up, even though the weather was going to become a bit horrible, I knew that I would feel much better, and I would also be able to see the finish would be a lot closer too. So really this was just about keeping going, which, as I said before, is fundamental in these endurance challenges. If you're trying to do the most miles in a certain amount of time, you've got to be on the bike for as long as you possibly can. It's a bit like the tortoise and the hare. You can have someone who's trying to absolutely batter it over a short period of time, but equally you can do as much miles as someone else, just going a little bit slower, but just staying on the bike. And at the end of it, you won't feel as wrecked as they do, and you could go further probably. And that's what endurance training is all about, really, is about doing a long ride, but at an effort that you can sustain. So at the end of the ride, typically when you're training, you won't be completely done in. You'll feel like you could have kept going. And that's ideal for when you're doing these sorts of endurance-based events. Every time you stop and get off the bike for whatever reason it is, if it's the end of the ride or a break or, to relieve yourself, you should feel like you can just get straight back on the bike without issue. And that's kind of where my effort was being targeted. So a quick look at the stats. Nothing really that stands out. It's pretty much similar as before. My speed's a little bit lower at this point, but that's kind of where my average speed was going because of the temperature and fatigue and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't up at the 17.5 miles per hour I was before, but your average speed is going to tail off pretty much as you go through, but you'll probably find it tails off and then it just kind of flattens out, as long as you're managing your effort correctly, which is what I was doing. You can see my average heart rate is a lot lower, but that's predominantly just because this is a 1 hour section of the ride and I'd stopped prior to this, so my heart rate was a bit lower. Also, the temperature was low, and when conditions are worse and you're feeling tired, it's harder to get your heart rate up anyway. So this was fine. I was quite happy with the 130 beats per minute. I knew my heart rate was going to probably tail off a bit over the event as well, same as the speed. And you can see here, there's the temperature, 32F, which is 0 degrees Celsius, which it was for a long period of time. So probably from about, I'm going to say 10, 11 o'clock at night, it was definitely getting round about the 0 degrees, and it wasn't until about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning that it started to go above 0 degrees. So there's a good 10, 11 hours there where it's 0 degrees, and that's tough when you're trying to stay on the bike. You can wrap up all you like, but the cold gets you, that's for sure, particularly on a road bike. And that's why at times during this night period I switched over to the gravel bike just for a bit of a change of scenery, but also it's just a lot easier to keep warm on the gravel bike because you're going a little bit slower. Also, the gravel bike at this point was a lot safer because 1, 2 in the morning, all the car windows were starting to freeze up. You could see that kind of shimmering effect on the road. It wasn't really wet, but the little bits of wet patches there were starting to freeze. So I was a little bit concerned about safety on the road bike. So again, that was a reason to switch over to the gravel bike. And it meant I could go different places. I didn't have to stay on the road. I could cut streets and go on some little tracks and things like that. So that's really all there's to say about the power hour. I did 16.18 miles. That was doubled to 32.36 and just obviously helped my total. But pretty much everyone who was going for this solo outdoor was probably going to be around about that region. So a few miles here or there in the power hour for the solo outdoor people. But I imagine for the team events where some people were really going for it, there could have been quite big variances in how many miles people were doing. So again, that's part of your strategy. If you're going in an event like this and there's key things you want to hit, then you have to measure your effort along the way to suit what you're trying to do. And this Red Bull time lapse is a great example of that. We've got so many different categories: teams, solos, female, outdoor, indoor. The strategy for each has to be completely different. Right, so the power hour took me up to 2 a.m. in the morning, the new 2 a.m. So I had to go until 1 p.m. that day. So I still had 11 hours to go at that point. So part 3, is what covers that. So let's have a look. So part 3 I named the final push because that's exactly what it was. It was a bit of a push to the end. And I would say in an event like this where it's over 24, 25 hours, it's definitely worth thinking about it in either maybe 2 halves or even 3 thirds. So my first third was, up until I was going to have a sit down proper meal, maybe change my clothes. The second third was getting me through the power hour and continuing into the night without stopping for too much to have a full on sleep. And then the last third for me was probably from round about sunrise onwards. Although my ride isn't broken down into those stages, in my head, that was my strategy. It was about getting through those thirds. And it's a common way to deal with such a long event. The longer the event, the more you have to break it down. And if you listen to Josh Quigley talk, if you've ever had the pleasure of that, about the 7-day record, he talks about how he was breaking it down really small sections, like just getting to the next town, which was maybe 5, 6, 7 miles away. So it was like, he started at Peter Cooter, I'm going to get to Dramoke, and now I'm going to get to Bankery. So that's the way he was approaching it. And he was churning out a serious amount of miles. So you definitely don't want to think about it as, I'm going to ride 25 hours. You have to break it down, or whatever the time period may be. And that's a key strategy for pushing your time out when you're training and when you're trying to do these sorts of things, is just focus on what's in front of you. And if you know that previously you've cycled 3 hours, then, you can think about that. I can get to 3 hours. And I know I've done that before. So when you get to the 3rd hour, you could say, hey, well, I could do another hour. And then when you finish that ride, you've done 4 hours. And then the next time you just keep approaching it like that. And that goes with so many things. Not just cycling, all sorts of endurance-based training or any training. It's about understanding what you can do or what you've done, you've proven to yourself, and then just pushing that a little bit further and going, oh, I did that. And then the next time you can go, well, last time I lifted 100 kilos, so this time I'm going to try and lift 105. And then after, oh, I've managed to lift 105, so I'll keep going at that weight, and then maybe at some point I'll do 110, and that's just how you keep progressing. And it's no different to being in an event like this. You have to break it down into small, manageable sections. So the stats for the last part 3, which, as I said before, was an 11-hour elapsed time. But you can see here the difference between my elapsed time and my moving time is quite considerable compared to the first section. So there's a difference of about 2 hours and 40 minutes. So essentially what that means is in that 11 hours, I was not riding the bike for 2 hours and 40 minutes. That was a lot more than I planned, but a lot of it came down to having to stop frequently to warm up. Even though I was totally wrapped up and had shoe covers and all that kind of stuff, I was finding my feet were getting really cold. And I just had to, maybe churn out an hour and a half, 2 hours, come back to the house, get inside for 10 minutes, warm up, have a cup of tea. I was literally sitting on my kitchen floor having a cup of tea with my wife's hairdryer pointed at my feet, warming myself up. And then I'd go back out and, within maybe 30 minutes or so, my feet are starting to get cold again. And then within about an hour and a half, 2 hours, they're just absolutely frozen. You start to get to the point where you can't feel them. And then you notice that your speed starts to drop off. Everything starts to feel a bit more difficult. So I was just stopping and just resetting the clock, because I knew this was going to be going on for many, many hours. If it was going to be really cold for a few hours and then get warm again, I would have just pushed through. But I was thinking ahead to, I really want to be in good shape for when the sun comes up and the temperature starts to rise. And because at that point, the weather was going to get warmer, but it was going to get windier and wetter. So I definitely had to be in a good frame of mind for that last final push. And I guess partly in my head, I thought, that's the more time progresses in an event like this, the more likely it is that other people are going to slow down, stop, give up. I wanted to make sure that in the last seconds of this event, I was still on the bike. The other thing that contributed to the stop time was probably about a total of 40 minutes. I had a 30-minute power nap. I was going out and I was finding I was like nodding off on the bike. So what I did was I realised the sunrise was coming up relatively soon, so I made a point of stopping before sunrise and getting a 30-minute sleep in, which I did. I literally lay down, set my alarm for 30 minutes, fell straight asleep, woke up, and felt pretty good when I woke up, to be honest. Partly because I'd had a sleep, and then partly because I'd done exactly what I'd planned to do. I woke up, I could see that the light was getting lighter outside, and then I could feel the end. The end was only 5 or 6 hours away at that point, and I knew I was in the final leg, and I was doing pretty well, and I had a good chance of getting towards my target of 350. So, other parts of the stats. So I did 126 miles in this final 8 hours and 20 minutes, or 11 hours elapsed time. And you can see here my average speed is round about 15.2 miles per hour. Now, actually, from when I started this ride, my average speed was actually down in the 14s. So through the night, I was, even on the road bike and on the gravel bike, I was doing around about 14 and a half miles per hour, something like that. It wasn't until the sun came up and the temperature rose that my speed drastically increased, and that took that up to 15.2. In the last hours, I was more up in the sort of 16s and 17 mile per hour, which overall gave me this sort of 15.2 mile per hour figure. After my power nap, I went back out on the gravel bike again because it was still really cold at this point, and I just wanted to get myself going. The next hour or so was just about getting back on the bike after a sleep and making sure I was fueled and felt okay. I was sticking around locally where I lived just because of the temperature. I knew I'd have to come back and warm up and actually change my clothes to get back on the road bike. So I did an hour or two probably on the gravel bike, and then when I got to the point where the forecast was telling me the temperature was going to rise, and it was going to rise really rapidly, it was very strange actually. It went from 0 degrees to 7 or 8 degrees in a matter of minutes. Prior to that, I got back to the house, got all kitted up, got a cup of tea and some proper food into me, and got back out on the road bike for the last 3 or 4 hours of the event. Going on the gravel bike and switching things about like this and having a power nap, some of that it wasn't so much planned. I had it in my head, these are things I might have to do. So I kind of like, they were like contingencies, if you like. But as I'm going through the event, I'm planning ahead. So I'm adjusting my plan. I have like an overall plan before I start, but as you go, you have to make changes based on the conditions and how you feel and all sorts of things, safety, all that kind of stuff. So I was tweaking the plan as I went, and as I got to these latter stages, it was really about what am I going to do for the next hour or two, and I was breaking it down even smaller because it was just much easier to think about. And also the weather conditions were changing rapidly. I was going from 0 wind, 0 degrees, freezing conditions everywhere, to 8, 9, 10 degrees, which is quite warm actually for a bike ride up here. But then from 0 wind to like 20 to 25 mile an hour winds in the course of these last few hours. So I was having all this in my mind. So I was breaking it down into sections. It's going to be cold for this period. It's going to change. So I therefore have to be prepared for the next bit. It's going to be warmer. It's going to be a little bit windy. So I need to be prepared for that. And then at the end, it's going to be windy as hell and it's going to be lashing of rain, but it's not going to be too cold. So again, I had to be prepped for that. So I had all these little mini plans lined up in my head, and I was very happy with how it went. At no point was I like, oh, I'm going to stop or give up. I was properly prepared to keep going on the bike. And again, you can see the end in sight. A few hours out, there was no way I was stopping. It would have I'd had to be injured or crashed or just physically not be able to continue for me to stop at this point. Cadence is still pretty good here. I definitely, that's something I've worked on over the last year or so, is making sure I keep my cadence up. It's quite easy to drop your cadence towards the end of a long ride and you just start churning out of gear, and that can bring real big problems. Like if you're pushing a really hard gear when you're tired, there's a good chance you're going to injure yourself, maybe have issues with your knees, and you're going to burn a lot of energy. There's this terminology, spin to win, and I think that is the case no matter how long you are in a ride, you've got to keep the pedals turning and be conscious of your cadence changing at the time. And if you feel like it is, just drop a gear and spin the legs for a bit, and you'll probably just find you naturally just continue to do that. And then what I find is I drop a gear, spin a bit, and then I start speeding up, and then I'm able to change back up to probably the gear I was in and spin a bit faster. And then overall that means you're going faster. So definitely think about that as well when you're riding your bike. Just make sure you're always spinning the legs, and you'll probably find if you drop a gear, spin for a bit, you'll be able to get back up to the higher gears and keep spinning, and overall you'll go faster. Then finally, probably elevation. You can see here that the elevation, 3,400 feet for 126 miles, the average per 10 miles is a bit higher. It's more towards the 300 feet, but this is because I'm riding predominantly round where I live as opposed to going out a bit further onto where I was earlier. That was just a bit of a sacrifice, really. I could have gone out to that location and had a flatter ride, but I wouldn't have been able to stop and warm up and have a cup of tea and these kinds of things. So that was always part of my strategy, was to go away from home, hit the flat section, just ride somewhere differently for the first 7 or 8 hours when the weather was okay and I was feeling totally fresh, and then through the night stay really close to home and make sure that I had fueled up and all the rest of it, and if I needed to stop and change clothes I could. And then I carried that on until the last few hours. I went a little bit further away from home, and the intention was not to stop. I was just going to ride the last 3 hours. I put plenty of food and clothes and that with me, and I actually dumped some by the side of the road, and I was doing like a mini lap. But there was, I was away from home essentially, but I had everything with me, and it was the last 3 hours, and there was no stopping at that point. And again, you can see the temperature here. It says 39F, but Strava's just giving you a temperature at a given point in time. This is the temperature range here. It was actually 0 to 10 degrees Celsius was the temperature range. That 10 degrees didn't really happen until the last couple of hours, like I said. And if we scroll down, you can sort of see an illustration of what I was doing on my route. So you can see I was riding around where I live mainly. There was a little bit of a journey off to do a bit of exploring, but pretty much these are like repeated loops around where I live, really close to my house. And then right towards the end here, you can see this change, and this is where I was doing laps, and you can see on the map here. So I'm doing it sort of Kintour, close to where I live. This is there's a bit of exploring going on over here, and then I cycle over to this area near a place called Kemney, and the reason for that was because the wind direction was coming from the east, so it was coming from the right hand side here, and it was picking up, and I knew it was going to be like really, really quite windy, and also the rain was coming in, so I knew I was going to be getting battered. And this loop I was doing around Kintour was not preferable for an easterly wind. I was started to do it in the easterly, but I knew straight away that it wasn't going to work. And then I was thinking in my head, right, where can I go that is going to be suitable for this wind direction? So what I did was I realised that this loop here, which is, people actually use it as a bit of a training loop. They go round and round in a sort of chain gang. It's only about 3 miles, but you can see here, this is the loop, this triangle. So the wind's coming from the east here. So what that means is this bit here, you've got the wind pretty much up your back. It was actually coming more from the southeast, but it was coming basically up my back here as I went round. You can see the direction I'm going clockwise. So I had a really good tailwind, and this section was also slightly uphill. So I was got a tailwind. It was slightly uphill, so I was getting a bit of elevation, and then I would turn, and here the wind was coming like not straight, it was coming across my side. The great thing is though that there's a lot of trees and tree cover. So this bit's really exposed, which is perfect because I had the wind up my backside and it was pushing me along. As I turned here, there was just certain sections where I was hitting the wind, and then other sections where I was being sheltered from the wind. And I was actually able to go at a reasonable speed along this section, and it's pretty flat. So it's almost dead flat, to be honest. So it's a nice section to get on the aero bars and just push through the wind. And then as you turn here, you do kind of have, I did have the wind coming on the other side of me, but it was actually helping a bit. I was getting a bit of a sail effect. It was coming in at a bit of an angle, but also again, half of this, at least half of this, is completely tree lined. So the first half you didn't really notice the wind. So overall, this loop was quite efficient for that wind direction. So again, that comes back down to planning. The wind, that I knew there was going to be this wind and rain. I didn't 100% know exactly the direction it was going to be, but I cycle enough around where I live that I can think about the wind direction and think, okay, if I go around in a circle, where's the best spot to do this? And when I came out here initially, I actually was going the other direction because I felt like, oh, maybe that would be a good way to go because this is downhill here. So I thought, well, that'd be good. I'll go downhill into the wind and then it'll help me going round. But I did one lap and I knew straight away that's not the best way to go. I turned around, did the other lap, and straight away knew that's way faster. So again, this is this like in-ride planning. So you've got your pre-ride planning, pre-event planning, and then you've got to have all your contingency plans that you then just implement as and when they're needed. And the key thing probably is not to wait too long to implement them. You've got to recognize there's a problem coming up ahead. And as soon as you see that it's having an impact on what you're doing, you have to really think about changing at that point. Because you can always change back. There's no harm in trying something new and then going, oh, that didn't work, and then tweaking it until you find something. You're much better to do that than just push on, and then just, that'll mentally destroy you pretty much. And then at that point, your contingencies go out the window and you probably think about stopping and just giving up or having a rest, which at this stage in the game was not an option. So prior to going out here, I'm going along at fairly slow speed, in the 14 miles per hour. I could tell at this point that if I carried on like that, I definitely wasn't going to hit my target of 350. So this change of plan here was fundamental in me reaching my target and not just getting close, like I would have been miles off if I hadn't done this. But even when I was out there going around, I was fatigued, obviously. It was still, I was going to get close, but I wasn't sure if I was going to actually get 350 and above. And actually, as I was, even an hour and a bit, hour and a half away from the end, it definitely didn't look like I was going to get over 350. But as I mentioned in my previous video, something happened about 70 minutes before the end, which was a game changer. And what that thing was that happened was some people came out to support me. So Callum Innes, who was part of my support crew for the Josh Quigley 7-day record, he came out with his wife and son Robbie, who's a keen cyclist as well, and I speak a lot to him about cycling. He's really keen. It's really great speaking to someone who's sort of 14, 15, who's really wanting to get into cycling. He was inspired by Josh, and I'm kind of trying to help him as much as I can. But they came out to support me this time, and that in itself was a boost. The fact that they were there, and I wasn't just on my own, and they gave me a bit of a cheer. That was great. But they pulled up alongside me in their car, and their first words were, "How you doing? Would you like a coffee?" And I was just like, I couldn't believe what they were saying. I was just like, yes, I want a coffee. So I handed them an empty bottle. They filled it up full of Costa coffee, a nice big hot Costa coffee. And I had that on the bike and I destroyed that, gone in seconds. And from that point forward, that last hour was completely different to the previous hour. And I can actually illustrate that here on Strava, which is something I'll look at in a bit more detail in a future video, but I just want to touch on it quickly here because it's so obvious what happened and what effect they had on me that I just have to mention it now. After the ride, I set up this segment. Again, I'll cover this in future videos, how to do this and why it's advantageous, but I set up this segment called Easterly TT Loop because that's what it was for me. So if we go and look at that in a bit more detail, we'll go to the full leaderboard. So you can see here, it's a clockwise starting. I just started it just after this corner, this junction, and then finished it there. It was just so that I could analyze what was going on because I knew that that hour, even when I was just on the bike, I knew that that last hour was way faster than the previous hour. So I wanted to see exactly what had occurred. So you can see here, this is all these dots here are the time, the laps that I've done. So ignore this one because that's from my previous ride, but this one here is the very first loop I did when I went out there and I worked out which direction to go. You can see that that's quite fast. That's up at 17.5 miles per hour. That's primarily because the wind hadn't picked up at that point and there was no rain, but it almost appeared out of nowhere, and you can see my speed drops right down to 15.5. So it goes from 18.3, not 17.5. It's 18.3 mile per hour, and it drops down to 15.5 when the wind and rain starts coming in. And I guess partly I was thinking, well, this is me for the next 2 hours, and so maybe it was partly psychological. And it doesn't, it gets it varies, 15.5, 16, but it's, it's in the 15s, it's 15.5 roughly speaking. This point here is where the Callum, Jen and Robbie turned up. So at this point, they just turned up and my speed increases quite significantly at that point. And then this point here is after I've had my coffee and they've given me Haribos. So I had the coffee and I had a few Haribos and I had the whole bag sitting in my thing. So I knew I had them for the last hour. And you can see the effect. So I go up to 17.5, 17.4, it drops down to 17.1, but then I'm getting in the last half hour, I'm like, right, I'm going to start pushing a bit harder, take it back up to 17.4, and then finally I hit 17.5. So this hour here, night and day to the previous hour. And the crux of that is that if I hadn't had that coffee and that Haribo and that boost, I would have been about a mile short of my 350 target. As it was, I finished the ride with a total of 351.3 miles ridden on the bike. And I was absolutely delighted. And you can see my video, the previous video, I do a quick video right after getting off the bike and hitting stop. And I kind of summarize that. So go check that out to see what I'm saying right after it happened. So finally, just to close out the video, like I just said, I did 351.3 miles ridden, but there was a power hour. So this is the summary of what I did and also the standings at the end of the race. So you can scroll down here in Red Bull. You can see that's my nickname, Higgy. So my team, or me, I was Higgy. Solo category, outdoor. So that was the category I was in. And there's a summary of my figures. You can see the double mileage here for the power hour. And you can see what it says there, 16.18. So if we scroll down, solo outdoor, and you can see here that the planning worked, the execution worked, the coffee and the Haribos definitely worked, and I ended up winning by a reasonable margin, I would say, 32 miles. I was very happy with that. I thought it'd be a lot closer because some of these guys here, checked out before and after the rides. They're serious cyclists, guys that churn out some pretty good speeds, some pretty good miles, and yeah, it was a close run thing, and probably any of these top three here could have won it, but it just came down to being on the bike more. That's all it was about. If you're on the bike for the longest out of everyone, you've got a much better chance of winning these things, even if you're going a little bit slower. And that's more or less what happened. So that was obviously really good. I knew when I got off the bike and I checked the leaderboard that I was ahead, but there's this period of about 45 minutes to an hour where everyone has to upload their rides. So it wasn't until about an hour later that I actually knew I'd won. And even at that point, you still have to wait for clarification from Red Bull. And a number of days, I think, or a week or so later, I got this email, which is where I'm going to wrap up this video and where it wrapped up Red Bull time lapse. And you can see here, dear Paul, out of 404 riders, your team Higgy came first place in the registered competition category, which was solo outdoors. And I'm waiting for my jersey and my 24 cans of Red Bull and all the rest of it to turn up. But yeah, it was really good because I was a bit disappointed last year to come fourth, but primarily because I had actually ridden the most miles outside. So I knew if there was an outdoor category, I probably would have won that. This year there was an outdoor category, so it was just a case of doing the training, putting in the plan and executing the plan, and that's what I did. And like I've said, I say in a lot of my videos, I'm not an elite athlete, or I don't, I've got a job and kids and commitments and all that kind of stuff. And 18 months ago, I was riding 15, 30 miles on my bike at 15 miles per hour. And just through consistency more than anything, and research and planning, I've managed to get myself to where I am able to take part in these events and win them as well. And I really truly believe that if you're sitting watching this video and you're thinking about pushing yourself, and even if it's just cycling a bit further, a bit longer than you normally do, or going for an event, I'm confident that you can do it. And I'm going to put together some videos going into a bit more detail on each individual part of the process, and hopefully over time those videos will be something you can use to push yourself further. And maybe, you never know, maybe this time next year you'll be winning Red Bull Time Lapse 2021. So that's where I'm going to close this video out, and just thank you for listening if you made it this far. If you've liked what I've said, please hit like. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. And if you've got any questions, honestly any questions or comments, put them down below. I'll read them, I'll try and respond to them and answer them, and I will include anything that I can in future videos. That's all folks, so just remember to stay safe and take it easy.